Right, we begin here. The new wine into new Wineskins economic report by Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko and Prof. Mark Swilling is being launched. We're taking you there live now.
Aimed at catalyzing progress towards ending poverty and reducing inequality by 2030. Professor Madonsela, you've said and acknowledged that economics is not an exact science, but that this report is especially resonant with your Marshall-like plan and the vision you have for a thriving South Africa. Could you tell us more about how this report came into being and how it links to your M-Plan vision? Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you to the Institute for Sustainability for the privilege to address you. Thank you to Dr. Mark Swilling and Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko for the work that has brought us together today. It is said that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And the Ethiopians say, the time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the next best time is to plant it now. This report is very timely in that we are at a takeoff stage with regard to our journey to recover from the coronavirus, COVID-19. But when we set out as the social justice chair at Stellenbosch University, working with other universities and civil society organizations that are committed to social justice, we were not responding to the coronavirus, COVID-19, or the impact of the regulatory responses to it. We were responding to the fact that about a quarter of a century into democratic South Africa, we found ourselves being labeled by the World Bank as the most unequal society in the world, with the highest Gini coefficient in the world. We found ourselves struggling to heal the divisions of the past, with growing dissatisfaction on all sides and growing fracture on all sides, as was seen when I was investigating the investigation on state capture, and suddenly the white monopoly capital campaign was started. Although it was started with nefarious reasons and it was orchestrated by a foreign PR agency, which we know as Bell Pottinger, it caught ground in our country, which meant that it had touched a nerve among our own people. And therefore, the Social Justice M-Plan, as you have said, Nina, is a Marshall Plan-like initiative that seeks to make sure that all hands are on deck to advance social justice, with a focus on ending poverty and reducing significantly structural inequality by 2030, in line with the Global Sustainable Development Goals and our own National Development Plan. And why a Marshall Plan, which we call the Musa Plan for Social Justice? The idea is to make sure that we leverage everything in society to advance social justice, and we don't leave decision-making and resource mobilization to government alone. So that's the idea of the Marshall Plan. But at the core of the Marshall Plan is also a vision-based journey, an outcomes-driven journey, and an evidence-based planning process. How is it that 25 years into implementing a constitution that commits to social justice, you've become more unequal? There's more unemployment. How is it that 26 years into implementing a constitution that is committed to social justice, this report is going to tell you that the wealth of the country, or rather, the wealth of the country that is based on assets, the bulk of it remains in the hands of 10% of this country. So the majority of that 10% are those that were privileged by unjust laws under apartheid, and on the basis of race, or on the basis of gender, or on the basis of both. So what's wrong with the way we have pursued our economics? What this report is going to say is you needed a visionary approach to things. You needed an economic strategy that doesn't just propose growth, but an economic strategy that finds a happy marriage between growth and redistribution. And it doesn't just say so, but it actually does so. And we remember that we had the RDP, we had Askisa, and we had GEAR. So it's not enough to say you are facilitating growth and redistribution. You have to show it in numbers. Hence, in the Social Justice M Plan, we're talking about leveraging data analytics to plan ahead and to consider any policy that we're planning to implement, what will it be its impact on the equality duty that is in the Constitution? In other words, will it exacerbate inequality? Will it exacerbate poverty? And if it's going to do so, you don't take it. And just lastly, at the core of this policy, at the core of what the two researchers are proposing, is not only reducing poverty and inequality, but it's placing the people at the center of your sustainable development path. We often hear people talking about growth, growth, growth. Growth for what? The Constitution does not make us an economy. It makes us a country of people. So whatever we do should be for the benefit of the people. Hence, they talk about a well-being economy. And that's what we signed up for. When we talk about we therefore adopt this constitution to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society founded on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. We're talking about establishing a society where all citizens have their potential freed and everyone's life is improved. And I do hope that this research output is going to contribute to the dialogue that's going to take place as the president releases his economic strategy and other research agencies release their products. We engage as a nation democratically to find the best solution in terms of building the South Africa of our dreams. The truth is, people disagree a lot because we don't agree upfront on where are we going. Therefore, to you, the route you're taking might be fine because you're going somewhere else. Whilst I will disagree with you because I'm going to a different place. And the idea here is, let's start with a vision. What does South Africa look like in 2030? And what pathways are most likely to take us there without leaving anybody behind? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. We really appreciate your opening words. Next, we will go to Dr. Moleko. Nthabiseng Moleko teaches economics and statistics at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. She's currently serving as the Deputy Chairperson of the Commission of Gender Equality, which enables her to advance the economic empowerment of women in society. And she also has a focus on rural and marginalized youth in this capacity. The Minister of Trade and Industry has appointed her as a board trustee for the National Empowerment Fund, and she also holds several other board positions. Nthabiseng completed her PhD in development finance at USB on pension funds and national development. She's also the first South African woman to be conferred a doctorate in this discipline. Her PhD research focuses on pension funds, savings, capital market development, the Public Investment Corporation, and growth. And she seeks to understand how financial development in Africa can be better used to aid economic development. So, Dr. Moleko, you've taken all of your experience in all of these different forums, your many years of research, and partnered with an incredible group of co-authors to come up with this new alternative economic report. It would be really great to understand more about what Professor Madonsela talks about in this report. Attempts to very intentionally solve for something, and it's driven by a vision. It would be great to hear how you all came to that and what exactly that vision is that holds this economic report together.
Thank you so much for that very, you didn't have to get into all that verbose intro. Greetings to our co-panelists who are here, Prof. Swilling, Prof. Madonsela. Thank you, Nina. And greetings to all who have joined us today just to hear what is this alternative economic framework. Every distinguished guest who's watching, my colleagues who have joined us, and also our co-authors and our workshop participants who played a very pivotal role in the formation of the 7 strategic interventions. I want to welcome them all. I cannot name them all individually. I know they are here. Immediately, just to start out by saying, what we have engaged on, what we have analyzed, what we have researched, what we have modeled, I'm going to start on the outcomes. What are the outcomes that you will see if what we are proposing is actually going to be a reality? Our focus is not necessarily to labor on the challenges, to labor on the limitations. And I think that's very much been the focus of many of our economic discussions, is to argue about the problems and the divisions, to argue about the quantum of the problem. We can argue about the definition of poverty until tomorrow, I tell you, especially with academics. But ours is to really say, how can we forge an economic trajectory that will revive our hopes as a country, that will revive the hopes of the 10 million unemployed, and deal with the systemic and economic entrenched poverty and inequality, and I think what Prof. Madonsela calls systemic inequalities that the Constitution says we must heal the divisions of our past in. And so what we're saying is, if we implement the proposed alternative policy reform measures that we have modeled together with the ADRS modeling, the following is likely to occur. And I think that's where I want to start off. We're in a time of COVID-19. The effect on growth is massively negative. Our range is up to 12%, depending on the severity of the impact of COVID, which we will feel in the third quarter, and we've already started to feel it in quarter 2 of our GDP. It will lessen the negative impact of COVID. Secondly, the recovery period will be shorter. This is all in our report. What we are proposing is South Africa needs to have a growth rate of 6.2% in the next decade. And we are saying alternative and bold decisions need to be taken by our leadership, by our economic cluster, by trade unions, by the private sector, all decks on board. We cannot have an conflict of interest where you're only looking to your own interest. And I think in economics, it's what we call trade-offs. We have to look at what are the trade-offs necessary so that we can all reach the desired 6.2% outcome of growth. The projections by the Center of Economic Development has projected that if we are to have the same average employment rate as the rest of the world, we have to grow at an average growth of 7% for a for 15 years. So what we are saying is it's possible to have 6.2% growth in a decade, but how will you get there? We will get into the detail. We're also saying that if you implement our alternative policy reforms, you will create between 8.7 to 9.8 million jobs, depending on the implementation efficacy, but also on the strategies and the approach of the strategic interventions that are taken on by the economic clusters. The different economic clusters are both the economic clusters and all the enablers, that being your energy subsectors, that being ESCOM and how we deal with the energy crises, because it's a requirement for growth to occur that you actually have a stable, cost-effective, and have a mix of renewables, particularly an energy transition from coal in South Africa. We also are saying that if you implement what we say, the unemployment rate will decline by almost 70% in 2030 to 12.2%. We have to deal with the issue of unemployment decisively. The economic strategies that we employ have got to deal with it decisively. And labor absorption, or what we call labor intensity of employment, or employment intensity as economists, is really on the low in South Africa because of the capital-intensive nature of our growth and the deindustrialization that has continued to systemically happen over our last 25 to 30 years. Poverty must drop, and we are saying if we implement what we are saying, we have measured it, and we have said poverty will drop by almost 50% to 23%, is over 50% right now, and inequality will decrease by over 16% in the next 10 years. We have modeled this. You can go into the report to read how we have modeled this, the econometrics that is behind it. But the question really that you probably all have in your minds is, how did we get here? How do we get here? Are we telling you a wish list, or is this really possibility in terms of arriving at this? The first thing that we did, and I'm going to section my presentation to how we arrived at this, we started at the problem. We made a diagnostic assessment of really where the problem lies with our economy. We've gone through a very high level and rigorous approach in terms of looking at where are the systemic failures, where are the inefficiencies, where are the market failures in our economy. And I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. The second thing that we did was we had to look at the theoretical underpinnings and the change in the movement. Prof. Mark Swilling will deal with that as well in his presentation. But we really looked at the underpinning theoretical framework that drives some of the economic policy thinking. And we are saying we need a robust shift. We have to shift from where we are. The world has moved. We are where Edgar Hoover was in 1930s, after aggression, refusing to systemically stimulate the economy because of a fear of the Keynesian model of economics. And yet the world has already used stimulus measures, particularly in times of economic shock, to get the economy moving. This has happened in Asia. This has happened in OECD economies. This has happened across the world. And South Africa will not be the first to implement fiscal measures that are expansionary in nature, and particularly using your monetary policy, your fiscal policy, together with your trade policy to boost localization, to boost household demand, to boost productivity, and to improve business confidence, which is sorely needed in all our subsectors and across the sphere of the economic space. I'm going to get into some slides now. Economists love presentations, but I've got a few slides that I believe will help organize my argument and also propose some concise and decisive points as to how we arrive at this. And the diagnostic assessment that I'm starting out with is covered in a few of the slides that I'll show you. Just a few slides I will come back on shortly. The presentation that you're seeing, the report is available on the Stellenbosch Business School website. We will provide that and on our URL handles on our relevant social media platforms at the end of the presentation. If we don't do what we are saying, the likelihood is that poverty, unemployment, inequality, the low growth and the low employment track will remain. This will be what we see if we continue to implement what has not worked. On the left-hand side, you see there the growth trajectory, the real GDP growth year on year in South Africa post the pandemic on 2009. What is clear is that we have been unable to recover beyond a 2% growth rate since 2012. 2013 period. If you look at our performance prior to the recession, we had recovered somewhat and it peaked at 5.6% growth. At that peak, our employment levels were at their best levels at an unemployment rate of 23%. But I want to say, unemployment of 23% in any country is a crisis. So even at our best economic performance, we had a youth labor market constraint. We also had a youth labor market, or rather labor market exclusionary issue. And we have a problem where the matching supply and demand of our labor market is not matched. And we have constraints in the absorption of the millions of our youth that enter the labor market per annum who are not adequately absorbed. The youth unemployment is sitting at almost 70% if you look at the expanded definition. Unemployment is sitting at 42% if you look at the expanded definition. And I think that's where we need to focus, because it's not normal to have 4.5 million discouraged work seekers in a country anywhere. The result is poverty is over 50%. And year on year, real GDP, irrespective of what we have done, before COVID, I want to stress this, before COVID was sitting at 0.7%. Last year was approximately 1.5, if you're looking at the different downward measures that were done by different IMF or the SARB or the National Treasury, but they're always being revised downwards, and that is a massive problem. Inflation, we have been successful in targeting between 4 to 6% band because of our monetary policy. The main instrument that is being used of our monetary policy is inflation targeting to deal with the macro fundamentals. And what we are arguing in this paper, that you do need to look at the issue of prices of goods. However, we argue that we need to expand the use of our monetary policy, and we need to be more aggressive in using our monetary policy instruments, and particularly the Reserve Bank, with the type of development challenges that we have. And we believe it's a key resource for the state and the South African people to revisit and review the mandate of the Reserve Bank. We have also said that if we don't deal with the free fall, and in our report we look at all the scenarios of what can happen based on what we do as a country, the rate of free fall and the length of time you spend in the free fall is dependent on the fiscal stimulus you put in place and whether that stimulus quells the drop in your net exports, the drop in your expenditure in terms of government, or the drop in your investment level of investment that comes in terms of foreign inflows. In South Africa, what we are seeing is that when you compare us with selected emerging markets, in the report you'll see the detail. Countries like Turkey, Ghana, countries like China, Brazil, the BRICS economies that we like to compare ourselves are within this cluster. The per capita GDP increase, which really tells you the health of your economy and whether you're able to improve the livelihoods of your people, beyond just looking at GDP growth as a number or an indice, you really need to look at whether the improvement of the lives of your people is happening. And we can see where we are right now in comparison to where we were in 1994 is actually worse, which is surprising. This is very concerning for any economist. And you can actually see we had experienced a dip immediately at the time of the Asian crisis in 1998, and we are where we were in 1998, particularly in terms of per capita GDP. And this says that the quality of life over the last 25 years for the majority of South Africans has actually not improved. We need to do something about this drastically. I love this slide because it tells us really what have the outcomes been of the different economic policies that we have implemented over the last 25 years. We have seen the GEAR, the RDP prior to that. We have seen ASGISA, the New Growth Path, and the National Development Plan. Now, what many people will argue is whether NDP is a vision, is a growth strategy, whether, GEAR, is it a macro fundamental economic framework that was underpinning the growth trajectory, wasn't really a plan. Ours is not to argue about semantics. What we're looking at is the outcomes of those plans. And we can see clearly, if you look at the slide, on the gray, which is the navy on the left, the targets were always around 5.1 to 5.4%. On the light blue, you can see the outcomes. The worst performing 5, 6, 7 years we've seen economically is from the NDP, 1.2% average growth. That is not enough to deal with the social constraints we have. Whatever the economic policies that were underpinning are those of the NGP and those of SABC, which we haven't seen a move away from your neoliberal capital markets, your neoliberal economic policies in the main in South Africa that have been implemented. Many people would argue and say, no, GEAR has been implemented. That was the best growth path, but even its own target of 5.1%, it wasn't able to reach. We only reached 3.2% during that time. As Giza had the best performance at 3.5%, and this is still not enough, right? This is still not enough to deal with the historical inequalities and market failures and structural constraints of the South African economy. What then happens with the effect of the shock? I cited this from a South African report that was recently done, and it shows that everyone will be shocked. From a household demand, from agricultural exports, from your net exports perspective, wage earnings will drop. The numbers are severe, between 40 to 75% in terms of commodity demand. This will contract. We're a mining primary export commodity driven country. And the global slump has an effect on us. We've seen in the last quarter with the 51% drastic decline in the last quarter in terms of output. We've also seen household demand drop. Why? Wages are dropping. Employers, companies couldn't necessarily pay their employers 100% of what they'd previously paid. And many subsectors that were there were non-essential services that were contracted between 10 to 90%. The effect of this is that there is going to be a shortfall. We've heard the SARS commissioner tell us that 304 billion likely shortfall this year alone. And if we don't boost our economic growth, right, we see a deterioration in our fiscal sustainability. We see a deterioration of our debt to GDP. If we don't deal with that systemically, we are likely to repeat the errors of the past. So therefore, we are then proposing this alternative economic framework because we are seeing the policies of the past have not resulted in the outcomes that we want to see. We are proposing a break from the past to a new and innovative come forward. What we have seen since June, and I want to now come to some of the detail of the report. In June, we've seen the Minister of Finance go to multilateral agencies to borrow approximately $7 billion US dollars for the shortfalls that are imminent. This report clearly says that we don't necessarily think that should have been the route. We propose that there be alternative domestic resource capital mobilization methods that we can employ. The research that we have put in place in the section that talks to private sector participation, clever use of our pension funds. We're not talking here about taking your pension and building a road. What we are talking about is efforts and interventions that have been used by Australia, by Canada, by the US, by Asian, Latin American countries, where they take up to 30, 40, 50% aggressive amounts of their pension funds to drive their national development. They use their domestic capital markets to drive national development. We're not seeing this in South Africa, yet we have massive underdevelopment and severe capital constraints. We do not believe that we necessarily need to go to multilateral agencies. We also believe that the lender of last resort should be the SARB, which is our reserve bank. And there are many examples, again, internationally. Japan was able to grow its economy in 10 years in the last 2 decades because they used effective instruments using their monetary policy specifically in partnership and in coordination with the fiscal policy instruments. So the two have to be in synergy and they have to work together. So ours is to say, very big up to the state for the fiscal stimulus measures. When you look at the detail, though, you see that the non-interest expenditure was actually 36 billion. I know everyone talks about the 500 billion. It's not actually 500 billion. 200 billion was guarantees. We also argue that our DFIs should be a part and parcel of those 200 billion guarantees. Why? Because in the main, they're supporting those who are excluded. In the main, the private sector doesn't necessarily, they get non-recourse loan finance. They take very little risk. The government is their backup as a guarantee, yet the beneficiaries of the 200 billion are those who are probably already in the mainstream economy. So we're saying have a strategy for those who are existing in the mainstream, but also look at those who have been excluded so they can also be caught in, because we have to have a strategy to deal with both. And I think that that's what we're pushing in the report. So you'll see in one of the sections, which I'll quickly talk to, where we drive for a reform of value chains and a breakdown of oligopolies that have controlled many of our subsectors, particularly our supermarket and value chains, that requires and needs the focus of our Competition Act and dominance definitions, where we're very aggressive. There's also no real structural transformation that has been proposed since COVID-19. What we are saying is, therefore, when we talk structural transformation, in the main, what we've done analysis on is we've looked at the National Treasury economic strategy that came out and has now been revised. I think in the next few days, we'll see what is coming from the president. But I think what we're saying in the main, when we talk structural transformation, we must double our manufacturing value add. Why is manufacturing important? We've seen those economies that have been able to transform and change poverty and unemployment outcomes, and also increase their contribution to manufacturing value add to exports, have been those that focus on subsectors like the primary and your high value added goods manufacturing sector. Low scale manufacturing has the ability to quicken the ability of your economy to grow. Manufacturing has the ability to increase your labor absorption. Manufacturing has the ability to reignite and reinvigorate all our villages, all our townships, the economies, particularly small-scale manufacturing. And also I want to add, food, agriculture, all of us eat every day. This is a good that is highly inelastic in the sense that it, irrespective of what happens, whether COVID is upon us, all of you are going to the supermarkets. Why? Because you need to eat, right? So the food and the supermarket value chain requires a specific focus in terms of looking at increasing outcomes and output as a subsector, and we focus on that in the report. The point that we are making is that total investment as a percentage of GDP has not necessarily increased over the 25% level that is required for you to drive up growth. And we have done all we can with our neoliberal economic policies. And yet we still haven't seen the outcomes that we desire. And we're saying perhaps we should try an alternative approach. And this is where we are coming in to say, let's be aggressive in trying to use our domestic resources, our domestic capital, work together with all the different agencies of DFIs, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, work with the National Empowerment Fund, work with the Industrial Development Corporation, work with the Land Bank. And I know everyone wants to know what the Minister of Finance is going to do. I'm not going to be a prophet here. But what I'm saying is, let's effectively coordinate these functions and these agencies of the state so that we can quell the low level of public investment, which has gone down, by the way, over the last 10 years, if you look at the graphs. I'm not going to show them to you now. But as a result, public investment has declined as a percentage of GDP, and yet this is at the same time with all the other indices in terms of investment, and we've been unable to quell the growth question. Everyone is talking about debt to GDP. I've got to talk about it today before I close off. Debt to GDP will improve if we focus on growth. We've got to focus on growth, because growth as a proportion of debt, if your output or your economic output begins to increase, if you begin to generate household economic activity, if you boost and you use your fiscus, particularly your state expenditure, into these underdeveloped areas, areas where there's been very little trickle of flow into the economy, particularly your villages, economic areas such as Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, those regions that have high level of rural households living in those areas, we deliberately have said in our strategy, rural development is an imperative. We've deliberately said in our strategy, and we've put in place, analyzed all the some of the programs around agriculture. In the last 10 years alone, we've spent 45 billion on 3 programs out of, I think, 6 or 7 in the department. And that's a lot of money. but we haven't realized outcomes, and we detail in the report some of the interventions that can be put in place so that you can improve outcomes. So we say that the necessary fundamentals that are key, we've got to, number one, I'm about to close, have a decisive economic strategy. We have to have a clear vision that is labor absorptive. Labor absorption is not negotiable. It's got to be a non-negotiable. Any plan that we have has got to have measures and clear monitoring and measurable targets of how these proposals that are going to be proposed, even tomorrow, I want the nation, look at what is proposed. What, therefore, is the outcome, Mr. President? What, therefore, can you show will happen to unemployment? If it's not creating more than 7 million jobs in the next 10 years, the country should question, therefore, what is the alternative that can produce it, right? And I'm putting him on the spot here. But I think that we as a nation are at that point now where we need to put our economic policies to the test to say, what will the results be, just as Prof. Madonsela has said. Secondly, we say alternative mechanisms are needed to produce and enhance our productivity. The policy instruments of neoliberalism, the incoherence in our trade policy, speaking to our long-term industrial policies, they don't talk to each other, right? We need to have a serious economic restructuring that substantially increases both the share of our manufacturing sector as a means to growth, but also our manufacturing value add to the African continent. African continental trade, we talk about the new EFTA, but how are we going to use that across the board to derive economic growth? And NICs have shown that manufactured goods are key in terms of industrializing and growing your economy. Many say we've passed that point. We should just look at your 4IR. We should just look at services. We should just look at tourism. Our paper is in abject disagreement to that. We believe that you've got to have an industrial sector. We believe you've got to produce your food. We believe that you've got to have your distribution and value chains reformed, particularly develop your infant industries so that you can improve your local economies and boost your local companies to be a part and parcel of our economic trajectory. There's got to be a aggressive transfer of factors of production to Black South Africans, colored South Africans, Indian South Africans, but in the main, the majority of those who remain disenfranchised are your Black South Africans. Asians were also disenfranchised, but we believe that the distribution along historical racial lines must speak to the now aggressive transfer of factors of production to that. There's a chapter we deal with. And of course, we've got to talk about the state and optimizing the public good. Technology, and I think I will close with 2 points on energy, and South Africans must all work. We have agreed that digitization and a knowledge economy is a necessary, fundamental, and enabler that will secure the outcomes that we want. We do believe that the mineral energy complex needs to be responded to decisively. One of the key subsectors and new industries that can be generated in South Africa is your renewable energy as a subsector. We pull out Professor Borat's frontier sectors that he has done extensive research on. I don't know why we as a country are not using his research and some of the outcomes. We're working in a collaborative approach, I must mention that. And we're citing various works you'll see in the report from different South Africans who have done extensive work that we haven't necessarily used in the fashion that we should. I believe that one of those is those of the economic complexities that talks to, we already have manufacturing and the ability, or what we call economic capabilities, across many manufacturing subsectors. These need to simply be enlarged and stretched because they're already in existence, and they are pointed out in our report as cited accordingly. And last but not least, we want every South African working. We believe that every South African must take responsibility for themselves and their families. Self-sufficiency should be prioritized over dependency on the state. And we believe that we shouldn't have more people who are beneficiaries of the state than those who have jobs. In this country, we have more people who are beneficiaries of the state than those with jobs. This is not normal. We have to change these outcomes. And we believe that if you implement our 7 strategic interventions across the state, if you implement Restore the Environment, if you rethink the development strategies in agriculture, in industry, if you drive aggressive transformation and transform productive assets to your previously disadvantaged, particularly in the main black SMMEs, you will see a diversified economy, an economy that speaks to the 21st century, an economy that absorbs your 10 million unemployed, an economy that is revived, an economy that really takes on new ideas. And we believe that these 7 strategic interventions that are in the report that drive domestic resource mobilization, that drive rural development and food production, that build the capacity of the state and growth through redistribution will really realize some of the outcomes that we are proposing. So please get our report. It's on the USB website. We will put all the links on our handles, our social media handles, once that is after this, because we are busy with this now. And we will all be available, even post this, to engage, to talk about what we have said. But we have hope for South Africa. We will come out of this recession. We will come out of this, and we will see a revived, a renewed, and a reignited economy. And we speak life over South Africa's economy. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Moleko, for that very impassioned account of the framework outcomes. It's always inspiring to listen to you and to be infused by your enthusiasm, but faith, really, and belief in what's possible. Thank you. So, to Professor Mark Swilling, who is a distinguished professor of sustainable development at University of Stellenbosch, and he's also the co-director of the Center for Complex Systems in Transition. Mark is the author of several books. His latest is The Age of Sustainability, Just Transitions in a Complex World. He also co-authored with Eve Anneke, Just Transitions, Explorations of Sustainability in an Unfair World. He is a member of UNEP's International Resource Panel, acting as coordinator of the city's working group. And Mark also serves as the deputy chair of the board of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Mark, you're passionate about sustainability, alternative economics, envisioning a developmental and entrepreneurial state. How do all of these ideas come together for you in this report?
Thanks very much, Nina, and thanks, Tuli, for the invitation that you extended to Nthabiseng and I to undertake this journey. We had a workshop back in March 2019, and then 2 workshops in August and in November, where we brought together people around a really interesting set of conversations and people whose voices are not the usual suspects that we hear in the mainstream media. I'm not an economist. I'm a social scientist. So the real economist in this mix is Nthabiseng. Yet we all know that economics is going through its own transformation. Many of the certainties of the last couple of decades have fallen apart. A recent article by the Financial Times beautifully crafted a narrative which basically outlined the way in which economic paradigms have usually shifted after a major crisis. Like after 1929, the shift to Keynesianism, after the oil crisis, the early 70s, the shift to neoliberalism. And now we have, one of the biggest economic crises we've ever had. And out of, what's the economic paradigm that's going to inform the way in which economic policy starts to get formulated? Because whether one likes it or not, economic theory, often crafted, as Keynes once put it, by dead scribblers who lived a long time ago and whose strictures we now currently live by. Maybe this doesn't have to happen like that anymore. Maybe we can start building economic policies that are context specific. So I want to just put up a slide or two around this question, and I'm going to focus on section 5, which we've called making visible underlying economic theory. And just in sum, I mean, this is not normally done in an economic policy document, but we think it's really important to be explicit about these underlying theoretical assumptions, which have also influenced the modeling and correspond with Asgar's heterodox approach. Economic policy, is shaped by theory, but economic theory has evolved. The post-Second World War Keynesianism shifted after the oil crisis to post-1970s neoliberalism, and the question is, now what? Where are we heading? At the fundamental root of these different paradigms is two basic conceptions of equilibrium. If you assume an economy tends towards equilibrium, you're going to assume then that intervention by the state is irrational. But if you accept that economies are like any other major system, natural and social, and they tend towards this equilibrium according to not just the first, but the second law of thermodynamics, then intervention makes sense. So in 2016, the summer of 2016, the northern summer of 2016 was a key turning point when quite a number of leading international economists basically declared that many of the economic paradigms that had been used in the previous 25 years are no longer useful, including Paul Rober, Nobel Prize winner and former chief economist of the World Bank. So what is the implication of this paradigm shift for South Africa? Do we just hang on for dear life to our precious austerity economics with debt ceilings and inflation targeting? Or are we prepared to let that go and creatively address our own context, the challenges that Nthabiseng has outlined? And I certainly think of this report. I'm old enough to remember some of our history, including the Merg report. And if you haven't read Vishnu Padiachi's and Robbie van Eyck's fantastic book, Shadow Liberation, which outlines the evolution of economic thinking within the ANC, and in particular what happened in 1993 when the Merg report was pushed aside, the Macroeconomic Research Group report was pushed aside in favor of what eventually became GEAR with its neoliberal underpinnings, as opposed to the Keynesian underpinnings of the Merg report. So the bottom line is this: there are no examples of developed or developing economy that successfully developed with low inflation and low debt to GDP ratios. Why do we think we can do that, especially given our inequalities, our development challenges, and our current economic crisis? And that's really what this chapter outlines and puts forward an succinct alternative way of understanding not just underlying theory, but also some of the macroeconomic policy choices at a theoretical level. Just coming to chapter 8, which is really the strategic interventions informed by the model outcomes that Asgar's modeling developed. These are the 7 strategic interventions. Use industrial policies to expand agricultural and industrial production, and these are just a few examples of what we refer to. Set up an industrial council, trigger the energy transition, 100 billion rand investment in manufacturing. But there's various other examples to give. Use labor policies to enable absorption of unemployed South Africans into the labor market, and these numbers have already been referred to by Nthabiseng, which are derived from the modeling. Thirdly, domestic food production and rural development. Not just the traditional farmer support, which is necessary, but also investments in new rural-urban value chains. Fourthly, stimulate investment-led growth to expand aggregate demand, infrastructure delivery, and international trade, issues which are not normally clustered together in this way. And what will be key, in particular for infrastructure, is blended finance vehicles to bring together public sector funding with appetite for higher risk, together with private sector funding with lower risk appetite, to kind of really start mobilizing investment in infrastructure in a way that doesn't have to rely on some of our hollowed out state institutions, which are going to take a long time to fix. We're gonna have to face this challenge of breaking up the oligopolies, and we're going to really have to take much more seriously regional trade opportunities. The fifth strategic intervention is rebuilding state capacity, and we consciously propose an approach developed by Matt Andrews and his colleagues called the problem-driven iterative adaptive framework, which is really, instead of these grand, visions and missions, kind of flip chart driven strategic planning that results in fancy documents which nobody reads, how do you build the capacity to identify specific problems, build the kinds of partnerships that are necessary in order to address those problems? And a very good example of that kind of work that's being done in South Africa is the Economic Development Partnership in the Western Cape. Rebuild the policy units that were dismantled, re-establish a democratic policy admin interface, and re-establish managerial training, not just policy training, but managerial training for public servants, which has gone into decline. The sixth strategic intervention is re-establish fiscal stability via expansionary policies that stimulate growth, thus reducing debt to GDP ratios over time. And Nthabiseng has already referred to that. It is really from the 90s, when we had very low debt to GDP ratio. Ever since then, Thabo Mbeki used to scare the nation by saying we can't go deeper into debt. We wish we had debt to GDP ratios like we had in the 90s. Now we're in a much more difficult position, but still, we cannot use that to just simply say we have to stick with austerity because there's no other option. And then finally...
All right, let's come out of that. That is the Alternative Economic Recovery Plan discussion currently underway. You heard there Professor Thulima Madonsela talking about ending structural inequality in South Africa. And I think that's really the main theme of what they're talking about. A very enthusiastic Dr. Nthabiseng talking about inequality will decrease by up to 60% in the next 10 years. And let's hope that is indeed accurate. Just a reminder that we will bring you the President's Economic Recovery Plan tomorrow at 2 p.m. on SABC News Channel. We will have a comprehensive breakdown of that plan as well. Please remember to tune in tomorrow. All right, well, that's it from me, Flo Ladob, and the rest of the team here at SA Today. Will indeed be back with you tomorrow, same time, same place. Please continue to take care. The Full View takes over from here. Cheerio.